Story 1. When a leader is no longer in a nation without a clear and formal transition plan in place, it tends to lead to chaos. Therefore, I would expect chaos. Story 2. The secured status of world leaders and diplomats would change overnight. United States government employees and random contractors would be arrested worldwide in retaliation. There might be war. If you want to take on Vladimir Putin, you have to be willing to take on all of Russia. Even people who hate Vladimir Putin would likely not side with the people ending diplomatic immunity. Story 3. I would personally raise the United States flag over my house here in the United Kingdom and play the Team America song on repeat at full volume. I may even donate to a bald eagle charity for good measure. Story 4. What are diplomatic laws like in the United States? I assume Vladimir Putin will enter the United States as a diplomat with a diplomatic passport, and because he has an invitation to the United States, he is probably entitled to diplomatic immunity, right? As far as I know, a diplomatic passport does not grant immunity automatically, but combined with an official invitation, that should be the case. And I mean, as strange as it sounds, it does make sense. You should not invite a foreign official on duty into your country just to arrest them. Sounds like something Russia would. Wait. Story 5. It would not happen because, just like Russia, we in the United States of America do not recognize the authority of the International Criminal Court. Therefore, we continue our actions around the world while pretending to be the good guys. Story 6. This is one of those questions in this subreddit that is completely meaningless, basically rhetorical, and gives users a chance to circle jerk about their opinions on Donald Trump. For the record, I cannot stand him either, but these posts are just dumb. Story 7. Scenario 1. War. There is a rally around the flag effect in Russia. The average Russian may be ambivalent or even hostile to Vladimir Putin, but we cannot underestimate the degree to which he is genuinely popular due to the dramatic improvement in the average Russian's life after the chaotic 1990s. The situation is worsening now due to inflation and reduced foreign investment, but the government has successfully blamed the West for these problems. Betting against there being enough pro-Putin or at least enough Russian nationalist sentiment that the elite would have to take more than a symbolic action is like assuming the Russian people would revolt as soon as it became clear that the Ukraine invasion was a poorly planned failure. Maybe not immediately, but when casualties mounted or the economy declined. 1 million casualties later and still no collapse. Russian nationalism in this scenario demands a response. He is a figure of contempt, but he is their figure of contempt. Scenario 2. Performative outrage. Cooler heads prevail. The Russian people and oligarchs are quietly eager to be rid of Putin and will only make threats to save face. Scenario 3. Aggressive performative response. Russia, China, and some members of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa plus others impose sanctions on the United States, accelerate efforts to create a new reserve currency, and various current and former U.S. officials are imprisoned. China and North Korea conduct their largest military exercises to date, and some incidents occur where shells and missiles stray off course. Story 8. They would have to start a nuclear war. Otherwise, they risk every future leader getting arrested or killed by the United States. The same applies in the other direction. Our security is not so tight that Russia cannot kill the president if they really wanted to. Story 9. I would bet that Vladimir Putin set up a planned nuclear response in the event of something like this, which they then quietly allowed the other country to discover. So, we would either face nuclear war or possibly avoid it if those under Putin chose not to obey once he is no longer in control. Story 10. Nothing. We have purposely agreed to these international agreements and led the way, but strangely never signed them. We do not want to be held accountable for what we sometimes expect from others. Additionally, if we arrested him, it would only create more international instability, leading to even larger problems. As much as I want it, it will never happen as it only creates a bigger issue, sadly. Story 11. Oh man. Do you still think this meeting is happening? The all-out paranoid Vladimir Putin will go to a foreign country that he considers a rival, in a place that is one of the biggest blunders for Russia. I am having trouble seeing this unfold. Story 12. It would be a diplomatic crisis and would probably trigger another Cold War, but I do not think nuclear weapons would be deployed over it. Story 13. On top of everything else, world leaders would refuse to meet with the United States president in the future. especially with a man as volatile as Donald Trump in charge. Story 14. It would trigger an international incident and most likely lead to conflict. It would also put United States ambassadors and personnel abroad at risk. It is unfortunate because Vladimir Putin absolutely deserves to see justice for his crimes, but we cannot just intern a world leader of a nation with which we are not at war without incurring serious consequences. Story 15. Honestly, the rest of the possibilities for succession might be much worse, especially with fighting to take over. The same applies to North Korea. You might think the current leader is bad, but the next one could be much crazier. Story 16. Making every single US diplomat a legitimate target at least risks nuclear war at worst. Inviting a foreign head of state, leader of a nuclear power promising immunity and protection, then arresting him is probably the biggest diplomatic mistake. That is basically a direct act of war, creating threat and instability for the whole world. Creating precedent in diplomacy always opens a Pandora's box. Also, the United States does not recognize the International Criminal Court just like Russia, so the United States is not obligated by any international or domestic law to arrest him. Story 17. 1. The United States would never again be able to host international leaders for events. The United Nations would have to move its headquarters. 2. You can expect every government worker at embassies in Russia and its allies to be arrested and executed or ransomed if Putin does not return. 3. Russian Civil War. Depending on who wins, war with the United States is possible. They may feel compelled, as a matter of national pride, not to allow Putin's arrest. For several unknown factors remain. Story 18. Depends on how loyal the rest of the Russian government is to Vladimir Putin. However, one would have to assume some form of war. A limited nuclear strike on part of Europe would cause absolute chaos, given that the Trump administration does not appear inclined to defend it. Yet, the economic chaos and embarrassment to Donald Trump could lead to a messy conflict. A really stupid World War III, if you will. It is not clear Russia would launch intercontinental ballistic missile nuclear weapons over it. It is also not clear that their silo-based intercontinental ballistic missiles are particularly operational. Story 19. Arresting the leader of another country and keeping them imprisoned in your country is, and should be considered an act of war. If Donald Trump were imprisoned in North Korea, I would hope beyond hope that the remaining military and political establishment in the United States would respond with overwhelming force. I dislike him, but that situation cannot be allowed to happen. Story 20. Putin's removal, either from power or from freedom, would have to come with an immediate invasion from either the West or China to prevent their nuclear arsenal from being unleashed. If Russia did not have world-destroying weapons and a group of individuals willing to use them, Putin would have been dead years ago. Story 21. In a normal world, I would say that the United States president would have to be incredibly stupid, criminally short-sighted, and radically unhinged to even consider such an act. You do not seize the leader of another nation on your soil for the same reason foreign diplomats and other plenipotentiary representatives have immunity. If you do it to one nation, some other nation will do it to you. This is not a normal world, however, but I still think the odds are incredibly low considering that Vladimir Putin probably holds damning compromising material on Donald Trump. Story 22. Is he wanted in the United States? I think the International Court of Justice may have an outstanding warrant for Vladimir Putin, but the United States of America is not part of the International Court of Justice, so I do not think they have a reason to arrest him. Story 23. The only way something like this could happen is if the United States secretly colluded with other Russian leaders to overthrow him and negotiate a conclusion to the war. Story 24. It is unlikely he would be arrested, as that would violate diplomatic immunity and put United States officials at risk. However, if he accidentally falls out of a 30-story window, I would not be entirely surprised. Story 25. I suspect the Russian elite will welcome it. Putin has been assassinating high-ranking Russians in a desperate attempt to fend off coups. I imagine many of them who are still alive are terrified of him and want him gone. They will not dare pick a fight with the United States when they are struggling so much with Ukraine. The only long-term consequence will be that other countries will be reluctant to have diplomatic relations with the United States. It is a kind of sacred rule that you do not harm ambassadors during diplomatic meetings. Story 26. If the United States arrested Vladimir Putin in Alaska, it would trigger a massive international crisis. Vladimir Putin is the sitting president of Russia, so detaining him would be seen as an act of war or extreme provocation. Russia would likely retaliate politically, economically, and possibly militarily. Diplomatic relations would collapse, and it could push both countries toward open conflict or at least severe escalation. The global balance of power would be rocked, with allies and adversaries scrambling to respond. In reality, it is nearly impossible for such a scenario to happen without catastrophic consequences. Story 27. It would set a really bad precedent. No politician could ever travel for fear of some foreign law being used against them. Story 28. Arresting world leaders on diplomatic visits is not a precedent the United States can set. It would be seen as an act of war. Thousands or millions could be sent to die in their name, and it is quite possible this could provoke a nuclear response. Story 29. The destruction of diplomatic immunity without the consent of much of the rest of the world would clearly lead to retribution against United States citizens and diplomats in foreign countries more closely aligned with Russia, as well as a direct response from the Russian government through force. Even if the majority of Russians were okay with Putin being arrested or assassinated, everyone under him in the government and military is a loyal supporter. It would also mean that most other major powers, allies and enemies alike, would no longer trust the United States government, regardless of its leadership, further damaging the ability to negotiate both United States and international interests. This would certainly open other countries to the idea of doing the same to former President Trump and other more extreme leadership from the United States if they were visiting foreign soil. Story 30. If the United States arrested Vladimir Putin in Alaska, we would be 2 news cycles away from World War III and 4 minutes away from every Twitter foreign policy expert logging in. Story 31. It would be terrible. We would lose trust with future nations that might have otherwise come to the table to talk. Story 32. Honestly, literally nothing. China would posture a lot, but they are not ending the world over Vladimir Putin. A new regime would take over in Russia, end the war, and likely pull back to the new borders. With a lot of tough rhetoric, but ultimately they are in no position to do anything. I could see a lot of "we must now prepare for war with the United States. That is why we are letting Ukraine off the hook. For now." Posturing is a cover for trying to keep their economy from collapsing. Their pundits fantasizing with artificial intelligence videos of mushroom clouds over Washington. What Russian leader is foolish enough to actually launch nuclear weapons on behalf of an old psychopath? If the United States holds him accountable, then who cares? They just go on with their lives and get to be rich. North Korea would issue many shrieks and fire warning missiles into the ocean. The biggest risk I see is them actually striking South Korea. That is the only potential war, and I do not think Kim Jong-un is suicidal. Markets would stumble a lot while threats fly, and then everyone would realize it is over a mass murderer and move on. United Nations resolutions, North Atlantic Treaty Organization conferences, International Court of Justice, and others would be all the rage for 6 months. We would likely be condemned by Ramzan Kadyrov and his supporters. Big deal. Story 33. Well, America would set off numerous reactions among all sovereign nations regarding its trustworthiness among first world nations. Additionally, it could trigger real retaliatory attacks, such as arresting U.S. diplomats and ambassadors within their areas of control. Therefore, this action is unlikely in the current timeline. Diplomacy is being used because Russia possesses nuclear weapons and hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missiles. It is not a pushover third world or second world country that can be easily invaded or have its leaders assassinated. Story 34. It would be clear evidence that you have been transported to an alternate universe where the President of the United States does not think the authoritarian leader in charge of Russia is a role model. Story 35. Russia cannot declare war because they do not have the military strength. China might, to preserve their oil reserves, but more likely China would support a puppet government in Russia as long as their access to resources was not curtailed. If it was, then China would expand fishing toward that one island to provoke a proxy war, hoping to reduce sympathy with Germany, which is economically weakened and reliant on imports. Story 36. Trump is friends with Vladimir Putin. He would never arrest Putin. When Donald Trump is finally impeached and charged with all his crimes, he is going to flee to Russia. Story 37. He will not, simply because he has something very damaging on Donald Trump. That is why Donald Trump has been acting compromised all this time. Vladimir Putin holds all the cards. Story 38. I'm surprised they are meeting in Alaska. It would be a bold move if Donald Trump arrested Vladimir Putin, but it won't happen. If you have researched Vladimir Putin as I have, you will know he is extremely paranoid and would not risk getting arrested. Story 39. The Supreme Court of the United States would probably throw him a party and say just teasing, then send him down a line of technocrat billionaires to stuff cryptocurrency certificates and $100 bills on his person like an exotic dancer when tax returns are rolling in. He probably already bought Alaska unbeknownst to the rest of us. Story 40. In a better world, the Vladimir Putin regime collapses quickly, and someone better becomes the new president without much bloodshed. Unfortunately, in reality, this would mean the start of war between Russia and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or civil war in Russia. Story 41. That is like saying you would not arrest Hitler because other people would take his place. Maybe the next one would be worse, but the odds are not. Story 42. I think it is more likely that Donald Trump will give away a part, if not all, of Alaska before the United States arrests Donald Trump. Story 43. Some comments discussing World War III and the United States being attacked with nuclear weapons show that many people greatly underestimate how advanced the United States military is and how excessively large the military budget is. Story 44. Two unpleasant elderly men, disliked by many, coming together to decide the fate of a country that most people appreciate. This entire situation is extremely disappointing. Donald Trump is without a doubt one of the least capable individuals to have ever led a country. Story 45. Funny, because I asked this to ChatGPT. It claims that the International Criminal Court cannot operate in America since we are not a member of the International Criminal Court, and the American Service Members Protection Act restricts cooperation with them. I'm not an expert, but I imagine the same scenario. Arrest Putin and be done with the problem. Story 46. An ultimatum would be issued demanding his immediate release. If he could not be retrieved, the prime minister should become president, according to the Russian constitution. In practice, the outcome might be more chaotic due to elite infighting and could bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. Story 47. There is more than one Vladimir Putin. Russians would claim it never happened or that the United States most likely truly captured a lookalike instead and made fools of themselves internationally. Now they would have a hard time in all diplomatic relations because officials would fear being captured by the imposter. Story 48. Nuclear weapons are on the way, and it would be the start of World War III. I am sure Russia has a well-thought-out contingency plan if even a hint of something were to happen to Vladimir Putin. Story 49. Trump is too difficult to deal with, constrained by pressure. There is no sense of accountability in the treasonous Conservative Party. Stop being so childish with your sense of honor. The Conservative Party has no honor. They are akin to the House of Duras without honor. Stop treating them with honorable intentions. It will do no good for this country or the world. Story 50. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations provides protections for foreign leaders, preventing their arrest while they are in another country. Story 51. There is an apocryphal tale that a British gunner informed Wellington that he could fire upon Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. Wellington is supposed to have replied, "It is not the business of commanders to be firing upon one another." However, Donald Trump would possibly have said, "Look, I could have taken the shot. Everybody said it was the perfect shot, a beautiful shot, the best shot maybe in history, but I said, you know what? I'm not going to do it. Commanders like me, we don't do that. We win so big, we don't need to. Napoleon, not a smart guy, very overrated. Believe me." Story 52. Their nuclear weapons are probably already aimed at major cities in the United States. If Vladimir Putin does not return, one of his trustees will be happy to press the red button, sending them all toward America. America's defense is advanced, but it will not intercept them all. Story 53. Creating a civil war in Russia and then attacking China's gas and oil supplies seems too good for those warhawks working in Washington. Story 54. Why should they? Vladimir Putin is wanted by the International Criminal Court. The United States is very much opposed to the International Criminal Court, except, of course, when the International Criminal Court is prosecuting someone the United States considers to be an adversary. Story 55. I see and agree that what may be behind Vladimir Putin may be worse. However, he is getting older. That time is coming. We need a clear answer to this question. The United States has just proven democracy is easily overturned. It would have been an answer for Russia, but it looks like there are people who desire a strongman approach. The challenge with the strongman approach is those underneath run amok. Zealots are waiting. The voice of the people must be liberated and these tyrants removed from power. Story 56. Worst case, you wake up to mushroom clouds over global markets and Reddit debating if World War III counts as a hot take. So yeah, don't invite Vladimir to your Alaskan barbecue. Story 57. No joke. 50% of Russia immediately surrenders because if you actually know how Russia works, you will understand that they are pathetically cowardly as a state. They only seem strong when others fear them. The moment someone acts tough, Russia folds. 50%, Putin is immediately forgotten. Power vacuum. Infighting. A new leader says something about "we will never forget," and will try to stabilize their rule and appease other nations. Story 58. I'm sorry, but I can't assist with that request. Story 59. Donald Trump would likely pardon him immediately and arrange for his return to Moscow on a first-class flight or aboard Air Force One. Story 60. Putin would publicly say that Joseph Biden and Barack Obama went to Jeffrey Epstein's island in exchange for a pardon. Story 61. Sovereign immunity is a universal pillar of international relations. This violation of that principle would likely be treated as a declaration of nuclear war, similar to when a foolish king mistreated Genghis Khan's ambassadors. This would not be America arresting Vladimir Putin. It would be taking hostile action against the Russian Federation. Probably not even El Salvador would fail to condemn this act by the United States. American personnel abroad might suffer retaliation, and most of it would generally be considered acceptable. An emergency meeting of the United Nations would likely relocate all activity to the Geneva headquarters or somewhere else. This would be very bad. Story 62. Maybe the world will get lucky and there will be a local earthquake affecting just the meeting building or something. Story 63. Chaos would ensue. However, he runs no risk of being arrested under a warrant issued by the International Criminal Court because the United States of America does not recognize the jurisdiction of the Hague-based tribunal. Story 64. One of his irrational subordinates would take command and likely start a nuclear war much sooner than Vladimir Putin himself would have. I am sharing the general opinion, and I think it is a fairly predictable outcome. Story 65. That will likely result in a confrontation between Vladimir Putin's security personnel and the United States forces conducting the arrest. I would pay to watch that. Story 66. It has been proven that Vladimir Putin has created several doppelgangers, and no one seems to have his fingerprints on record. Vladimir Putin is also extremely paranoid. He would be very difficult to arrest and verify that you have the real Vladimir Putin. Story 67. As much as I would like to see that, something tells me kidnapping the leader of a nuclear power does not end well. That is how the Russian Federation would interpret that action. Story 68. Not much. His country is done with him. If he has no power because he is under arrest in the United States, they would simply move on. Someone else would fill the power void. Story 69. My guess is his bodyguards would rather die in a firefight than Vladimir Putin being arrested by the United States of America. Story 70. His supporters and generals would commit acts of insanity to get him back in order to prove their loyalty and secure some kind of favor. If he was detained with no hope of release, the country would fall into chaos as generals and oligarchs started carving out their own territories. The country would likely implode within a year. They have demonstrated for decades that they are unable to hold functioning elections. Story 71. I think people either forget or do not realize how much Vladimir Putin wants Alaska back. Half of me would not be surprised to hear that we give him back some so he can have a piece of it again, to help stop the killing. Story 72, World War III could happen. Additionally, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. In fact, we have the Hague Invasion Act, which requires the president to take military action if a United States citizen is arrested by the International Criminal Court. Story 73, Nothing. The United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, so they neither respect the warrant nor have motivation to do so. Story 74, Russia would see it as an act of war. My guess is they would launch a massive nuclear first strike on Europe and the United States. 200 million dead in the United States, 100 million dead in Europe, 100 million dead in Russia. Story 75, Putin is not going to Alaska. Donald Trump literally stirs up this issue each month and pretends meetings are happening. Why on earth, even for his own safety, would Vladimir Putin travel to Alaska right now? Story 76, I think it would open the way to a war, but not immediately. Russia would call on the United States of America to return the president. Otherwise, it would escalate to military action. I think it is not possible because it is a diplomatic mission, and the United States of America would be violating the treaties. Story 77. I guess 3 options. 1. They seize power away from Vladimir Putin. 2. Nuclear holocaust. 3. World War III and then maybe nuclear holocaust. Story 78. War. The short answer is war. Diplomatic immunity is a concept that allows nations to interact, even if they are adversaries. Ignoring that breaks fundamental protocols of foreign relations. I would like to see Vladimir Putin behind bars, but it is not a risk I would support. Story 79. I'm hoping something else happens personally, but that would work for me, I guess. It's just not going to happen though, unless some immigration and customs enforcement agent tries to detain him because he is not American or whatever. Story 80. Why would the United States arrest Vladimir Putin? There is no arrest warrant for him in the United States, and the International Criminal Court is not recognized by the United States. Donald Trump is probably more likely to be arrested in Alaska, and I would estimate the probability of that as 0%. Story 81. This could be seen as a direct attack against Russia, which would allow the nuclear option for their leadership. Unless a coup would instantly follow, this would likely lead to very serious consequences. I think he will not, though. Trump has a soft spot for strong leaders. Story 82, World War III, any doubt, kiss your ass goodbye. The nuclear weapons would start flying, and you thought homeowners associations were bad. Story 83, I think there would be chaos and possibly a war between Russia and the United States that could escalate and become a world war. As much as I dislike Vladimir Putin, I think it would be a big mistake to arrest him. Story 84. Since Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, justice will be served, and there is hope for Ukraine to finally achieve peace. Story 85. To start with, I do not think that would be simple at all. Vladimir Putin is paranoid, and his protection is well armed. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.